forward now and let us know who you are, and we'll take it from there. I mean, apparently what you would gather would happen would be they would come, they would say, look, listen, I'm dealing in drugs, okay, then they would take them away for a questioning session to who's your supplier, where are you getting the drugs from, what do you do with them, blah blah blah. So not only do they get one less drug dealer to deal with, but they also increase their database and increase their intelligence.
That intelligence was then used to draw up a list of people to be shot. RAD worked their way through that list, leaving a trail of victims across Derry, the youngest of whom was 17.
Well, it's copycat stuff. It's a page out of an old book. This is stuff that the IRA did in the mid-90s when they shot dead a number of alleged drug dealers, and this was in the ceasefire period, and they used the cover of the name Direct Action Against Drugs. So now we have Republican Action Against Drugs, and it's a different label on the can, but it's the same product if you like.
It may be a familiar tactic, but it's happening in a very different environment. The Republican community is divided.
There is this battle for authority going on inside the Republican community. We know the dissidents and we know those people who would be involved in RAD haven't got much time for Sinn Féin. They're trying to build popular support within their own communities, and they would see this as a means of building that popular support.
But RAD's claim that they are operating on behalf of the community is disputed by those trying to catch them.
The question I have to ask is where's the money? You know, drug dealing is a cash-rich industry. You know, and if they're seizing drugs, they must be seizing money. What are RAD doing with the money?
RAD say they are filling a role of community policing in Republican areas, once performed by the IRA.
What they're saying is, we're a vigilante group, we decide who will shoot, when we'll shoot them, and to hell with everybody else. Their whole tactics, I mean, they're totally, absolutely undisciplined in terms of the way they discharge firearms in houses, in crowded streets, in crowded shops. I mean, it's ludicrous. If they persist in the way they're going, then people are going to lose their lives. Innocent people are going to lose their lives.
Well, of course, it's easier and safer to break into somebody's house and to shoot them there and then in front of their families, rather than break into their house, take them away in a car somewhere else and run the risk of being stopped, of being apprehended. So it's just simply a matter of convenience, and it's indicative of the ruthlessness of the organisation.
But in a statement, the group have claimed support for their brutal street justice from grassroots Republicans.
They do claim to have support from right across the community. In their statements, they have said they've got support from former provosts, former members of the NLA, and other groups. But they're mostly former provosts who would view the drugs problem as something that the PSNI are unwilling or unable to deal with.
RAD even claimed to have support from Sinn Féin members in the city.
I think that organisation is trying to ingratiate itself by actually saying that, because like any other organisation that is springing up in terms of small numbers in this city, they don't have any credibility. Now I think they're trying to get credibility by making nonsense statements like that.
But how can you be so sure though that that's nonsense?
Well, I say so because I'm involved in a party that meets quite regularly, and after those incidents, maybe then the attacks that are carried out, you can see that members of my party actually will stand shoulder to shoulder with the families and give support to those families. And I certainly have never been in a meeting or in a conversation with anybody within Sinn Féin who has actually says to me, you know, that they support what RAD has done in this city.
But why have RAD emerged now, at a time when Republican communities are inching closer to accepting policing?
Well, vigilantes arise sort of when people feel powerless, and when people feel sort of desperate about their situation, they want something done about it, and they can find nothing in official society. Then there's going to be room for vigilantes.
Being frank about it, some people would say, well, the fact that these drug dealers are now in fear of their lives has prevented them from spreading their poison. But the truth of the matter is, if your child, and some guy comes down and sticks heroin in your child's arm, and somebody went over and hit him with a baseball bat, you're going to shed a tear. On the other hand, as a Christian, as a a human being, as a whatever, you would say, morally I'm opposed to the use of violence.
These vigilantes, where do we stop? They have kicked doors in, they have shot people in front of young children and traumatised them. And is this the thin edge of the wedge? Where do they go next? Do they start dealing with people who are engaged in other alleged antisocial behaviour? And how do they know they're shooting the people who are even involved in drug crime? It's appalling. It's not acceptable in a modern society.
Republicans know there is little sympathy and much hostility to drug dealers in their areas. For RAD and the real IRA, that means two things. Any visible connection to drugs could drag them down, and by attacking drug dealers, they have a simple and popular way of demonstrating power.
There's such horror and hysteria about drugs that there are people who will say, well, I don't usually approve of anybody shooting anybody else, but that guy was a drug dealer. I got no sympathy for him. The RAD organisation was a very recent debutante, if you like, sort of in the armed activity in the Derry area. They're trying to establish themselves sort of as the primary force protecting the community, as it were, from the ravages of drugs. So they're looking for credibility. The real IRA, on the other hand, are, as they would see it, protecting themselves and protecting their own reputation by being seen to take very extreme action, as they have said, as they allege, against one of their own members, who they say was involved in drugs.
We understand the entire RAD operation, from intelligence gathering to planning to shooting, involves around a dozen people. They are led by two former members of the Provisional IRA. Their homes were raided recently by the PSNI, but no connection to the attacks was found. RAD don't claim to have a political agenda, but they are understood to have close links with dissident Republican groups in the city.
Now, that doesn't mean that card-carrying members of the real IRA or Continuity IRA or INLA. There's some people who would be of the view that some of those who are involved in these shootings have their roots in the IRA's punishment squads. But I think it's categorised as dissident Republican activity just to make the point that this is not mainstream IRA activity, because if it was mainstream IRA activity, the political roof would have caved in long before now.
Since the Provisional IRA has effectively left the scene, so to speak, and has retired, I think groups like the Real IRA are becoming involved in fighting the drugs trade in Republican areas. There has been a massive increase, from what I'm told, in drug dealing in those areas, and the PSNI isn't dealing adequately for it, so a gap opens up, and that gap is filled by dissident Republicans.
Drug dealers have also exploited gaps in policing in Republican areas, but it was a police raid on Kieran Bradley's home that brought him to RAD's attention. Suspicions were raised that he was back to his old ways.